Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic, one of our favorites. Let's do it. Redditors who work in remote locations, oil rig workers, or forest officers, etc. What's some of the creepier things you've seen while at work? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I work for a power company restoring power after a storm. Was working when a lady came up complaining that her power went out. We explained to her that's why we were there, and she should have power back soon. She said, "Oh good, my son went down in the basement and now I can't find him." I went with her with a flashlight down the road to a rundown house that was partially caved in. She walked inside and I went to follow. As soon as I walked into the door, she disappeared from my sight, and I called for her multiple times. No one responded, so I ran back to our work truck to call for help. A man that was living on her street called to me, asking what's wrong, and I told him the situation. He looked at me with a cold stare and said a mom and her son died in that house 4 years ago. I'm still shook to this day. My oldest brother used to work the overnight sprinklers on a golf course. He took me out one time just for fun. As we were driving uphill in a fairway, a figure of a lady appeared in the headlights at the top of the hill. My brother steered a little to the left of her and kept driving right on by. I stared right into her eyes as we drove by, and she stared back. Her eyes glowed like a cat in the night. As soon as we were out of voice range, I asked my brother, "What the hell was that?" He calmly responded, "Yeah, she lives on the golf course and likes to terrorize the workers from time to time. I usually see her out here once a week." I used to work out in the woods in Florida a lot. Creepiest thing would be this day we were working near Big Cypress, tromping through the brush all day. At the end of the day, my coworker and I do a quick drive-through of some of the property and realize the place was absolutely infested with water moccasins. We had been unknowingly essentially walking around a giant water moccasin pit all day. That one kind of effed me up. Well, you made it in an otherwise extremely dangerous scenario. Had you known they were in there, you might have never walked there, so interesting. I've been fishing out in the Gulf of Mexico, where they have some oil rigs. This rig wasn't being used from what we knew, so we would get pretty close to it to fish for red snapper. While we were out there, we could have sworn we heard screams of a woman over and over. It was some shit, but the explanation was that the wind making the noises as it blew through the rig. Well, that's what we were told, but it totally creeped us the F out. I work as a polar bear guard, as in I escort people across tundra and mountains and protect them from polar bears. I once saw a snowman totem with reindeer antlers coming out of his head. It was deformed, full of bullet holes, and rather creepy. Spent a summer in Wyoming going to the Bureau of Land Management land and other remote locations collecting data on bats and herpetofauna. Heard a lot of weird noises like mountain lions screaming, deer snorting, what sounded like owls fighting. Woke up one morning to find 2 bull moose sleeping 20 yards behind my tent. All of this was part of the job, until one night a truck was driving toward us when we were on a BLM square in the southwestern part of the state. The truck was going over land, no road, and was slowly driving at us. It stopped about 100 yards away, turned off the lights, and we could see a person get out. They walked a full circle around us at 100 yards away, got back in the truck and turned around. This was after dark, and this shadowy figure did a complete circle around us. You could hear them walking through the sagebrush, and I'm sure they could hear us talking. We packed up after that and drove to a hotel an hour away. I called the office and told them I was taking a gun when we went back out. Didn't like having the bear mace as our only defense. I used to work in the Gulf of Mexico on oil rigs for years, and it may not exactly be creepy, but I found it really unsettling. In deep, open water, the water itself is really clear, so everyone can plainly see all the tuna and barracudas hanging around the rig waiting for onboard cook to throw off whatever food waste he needs to. Every once in a while, a huge great white shark would swim up from underneath and snatch a tuna, and it really took like less than a second. They're really scary. My parents live pretty far back in the country, and I have one neighboring house. The neighbors would let their basset hound outside for about 10 minutes to use the bathroom every morning. One morning, they let him out, and he didn't come back inside. After a couple of minutes, they walked out to his favorite bathroom spot and found his head. Judging from the tracks, a mountain lion had ambushed him and apparently torn his head off before carrying the body away. What I thought was the creepiest part was that the family hadn't heard a sound. I mean, that's terribly sad for that dog and the family, but nature is a cruel mother, they say, right? So, that's it. Spent a summer doing conservation work out in the absolute middle of nowhere in Wyoming. Was part of a crew that would spend 2 weeks camping in remote places to do manual labor in places machines couldn't go. For this story, we were building new hiking and biking trails in the back portion of a designated wilderness area in a high-altitude desert. This means that the nearest civilization was a 2-hour car ride to a town of 41 people in a sandy soil area where tracks last forever. It was the middle of our stint during the early part of the night where everyone else had gone to bed, but I stayed up to read, so maybe 11:30 or so. Still pitch black outside. Clouds have covered stars, so my headlamp was probably the only light on in a 40-mile radius. Suddenly I hear footsteps walking around our camp and head towards the tents from where I was in the community tent. That sound immediately put me on edge as I felt the hair on my arms raise and my adrenaline spike. I recall thinking to myself that two things are very wrong, since the person was not using a light to see and the footsteps were not coming towards me from the tents. Rather, it was the opposite. Within the 4 seconds it took me to drop my book, get up, and turn the corner of the tent to crash the light on the sleeping giant tents. The sound had stopped, but I saw tracks in dirt before me. Looked like they came from one end of camp, looked into my tent, walked through the sleeping tents, and kept going out of camp again. I don't know if I was making too much noise or not walking around, but the rest of my crew ended up waking up and asking me what was going on from inside their tents. After explaining what I found, they all got up to look at the boot prints in the dirt. They were damn near perfect copies of my own boots, except for one small thing. I had a rock stuck in my treads that messed up the symmetry. I was wearing fairly common work boots, except I also happened to wear US size 15 double-wide boots, so there was no way in hell this was one of the other crew members. I don't think any of us slept much that night. Never saw or heard anything more after that night. A light rain removed the tracks a couple days later, but I do remember none of us were willing to step on the prints themselves and choose to step over them like cracks in the sidewalk. I work on large ships. If you get a clear view of a hull or passage that runs the whole length, you can actually see the whole ship warp and twist with the sea. If the passage isn't very well lit, it can look like a scene from a horror movie. I used to own a horse boarding and training farm with about 45 acres surrounded by woods. I used to spend the night there quite a bit because I had to start chores early in the morning, so if I stayed too late, it wasn't worth it to drive home. One night, at about midnight, my dog started to bristle up and growl at the door of the office I slept in, and then my iPod, which I kept on a speaker in the middle of the barn, started blasting out Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire at full volume, which I definitely hadn't left it on. Let me tell you, that song is effing freaky as shit in the middle of the night, like shit your pants freaky. My dog was full on growling and barking at the door, so I cracked it and let him run out, figuring that if someone were in or around the barn, he'd get them. Anyone there would have been trespassing at that time of night. After a few minutes, I went out of the office into the barn aisle with the bat to turn off the creepy-ass music. The light I usually kept on, so I could look around and see it was off. So it was pitch dark in most of the barn. My dog was just staring out the barn door, which I kept open in the summer to keep the horses cooler. With the hair bristled, but wasn't leaving the barn, which he was allowed to do. I wrote it off as creepy as F, but ultimately just one of those things, you know? Like, it's weird and I can't explain it, but there's got to be an explanation I'm just not privy to. But the real scary part is that my property shared a private gate in the back with the property closest to mine, which had a gate at the back. Most of my property was fenced because of horses, and the property next to mine was like dozens of acres fenced with a chain link fence, which, if you know anything about rural fencing, is not done. Anyways, we found out later that the owner of the adjoining property was Todd Colehep, the South Carolina serial killer. He had a woman chained up like a dog on his property who he and his friends would R and walk around the property on a leash. He also had some bodies of people he killed and buried on his property. He was doing all that stuff while I lived next to him. In fact, I used to ride on his property, but would always turn around if I heard machinery. In retrospect, finally, and probably buying bodies, or got the creeps, like something would tell me to turn around and go home. I was probably one of the few, if not only person, beside his friends, who were R-ing the woman to go on his property while all that was going on. I've worked in Canada's north for a few years now in oil and gas. It's pretty creepy when during night shift you realize a moose has just been standing at the tree line, staring you down for an unknown length of time, or finding bear tracks crossing the tracks you just made 5 minutes ago. Honestly, the silence of a snowy forest in the dead of night, hundreds of kilometers away from anything, is pretty spooky. When your only contact with the outside world is a radio channel nobody's listening to, you feel pretty alone. I know this is a grass is always greener thing for sure, but the idea of being that far in a remote area in the woods in the winter for a short period of time sounds awesome. It was the creepy occurrence. I live on a ranch off a quiet dirt road. Our distant neighbors' nearest house is about 1 mile away as the crow flies, have had issues with people stealing things out of their outbuildings and storage sheds in the area. It was also late in the year, so it was starting to get dark around 6 p.m. So as a result, every time I would see headlights go down our road, I would watch them to make sure they weren't stopping on the property. One evening, I see a vehicle going very slowly down the road and come to a stop at the end of our driveway, about 120 yards from our front porch. The vehicle is parked right in front of a 60s pickup I have parked, so I think whoever it is might be looking to steal it, or just looking over the property. Whatever the case, I decided to put on a black coat and grab my rifle to go investigate. It's dark out, so I stay out of the headlights of the vehicle so I can get close. I can tell it is a white van, but I don't see anything else distinguishing about the van. When I'm about 50 yards away, the van backs up and turns into our driveway. I freeze as the headlights wash across me standing in the middle of my driveway, and I see the reflective FedEx badge on the side of the van. Needless to say, the FedEx driver probably shit his pants as he suddenly sees a dark figure standing in the middle of a field in the dark holding a rifle. Surprisingly, after I try to give a friendly wave and Smile continues to drive up or drive away to the house, and I get to explain the situation and we both have a good laugh. So that's how I got to be the creepy guy in some FedEx delivery driver story. I work for a medical examiner and used to be on the graveyard shift alone. The first night I was on at midnight and the DOT, our air system, shut off, which caused the vents to warp. That shit sounded like somebody running through the vents in the ceiling on all fours. Thankfully, I got used to it, lol, but definitely creepy at first. Another night we lost power and stupid me watching a horror movie working so hard almost shit my pants when everything went dark, and knowing that a room with around 30 dead bodies in it was walking distance away. That one I stayed in my car for, not to mention the constant long dark red lit hallways. Glad I'm not an overnight now. I spent some time in the peat swamps forest of Borneo studying wild orangutan. We would go into the forest very early around 4 a.m. One morning, there was a clouded leopard on the trail. We used to enter the forest. It was just crouched there watching us. We shouted, tried to act big. One of the indigenous people we worked with even took out his slingshot and shot rocks at it. He missed on purpose, just trying to scare it off. It stayed there for a good 5 minutes watching us before it slowly walked into the thick brush off the cleared area. When we walked by, I shined my light to where it had been walked to and could clearly see a pair of reflective eyes only 3 meters away, crouched, watching us pass. Creepy, but also incredibly cool to see one in person for how critically endangered they are.